Are you afraid?
No. When I am, I will master my fear.
In 2007, the first Golden Compass film fumbled its way through everything the 2019 His Dark Materials show takes great pains to get right, yet it somehow nails the very thing His Dark Materials got wrong. And unfortunately, it's the most important part, for me anyways. I discovered the His Dark Materials book series as an adult. It wasn't a childhood favorite, I didn't grow up with it. When I was 18, a friend of a friend I really liked poured his heart out to me one night about his love for the series. And the electricity of his words planted a longing in my heart to find out what the fuss was all about. It's one of my favorite things to do, to listen intently when someone speaks passionate about art they love. Something I didn't always do growing up and diligently try to do now that I'm old enough to understand how much it means to them. My reason is a selfish one. Hell, it might be the reason I have this channel at all. There's nothing worse than pouring out your heart to someone about some niche piece of nerd culture that's consumed your life at some point or another, or changed you in a tangible way, only to feel stupid afterward. Like you're boring everyone with your weird obsessions, the nagging need to shut up.
Just shut up.
I've had the privilege of finding a few people in my life that listen to my mad ramblings. It's the best feeling in the world. One I hope you feel too sometimes. I want others to listen to me and validate my silly obsessions, and my mom always taught me to treat others how you wish to be treated, so I guess I try to indulge the people around me to the extent I want to be indulged. That doesn't mean I always connect with everyone's passion, but listening with an open heart has paved the way to discovering many gems I might never find otherwise. So, long story short, His Dark Materials was one of those gems. I grew up in love with Lord of the Rings, and the Chronicles of Narnia captivated my childhood. I was told His Dark Materials was like atheist Narnia, a curious description now, looking back. But it piqued my interest back then. In those days, I was an edgy sort of adult. Funny enough, it took me a while to get around to reading the series. I didn't run to it immediately, but stashed it away for the day I had the time and motivation to give it a proper crack. A day that turned out to be rather rainy. Metaphorically, at least. I started the series on Audible. I'd just been hired at a mindless warehouse job, and had only just begun using podcasts and audiobooks to pass the time. If I'm being totally transparent here, I was also pretty depressed. I wasn't the person I am today. I had fallen out of reading for a time, and downloading the Golden Compass was a desperate attempt to rediscover fantasy. One of those divine moments where after endless scrolling through Audible's Discover tab, I stumbled across the title and it rang a bell. I remembered my friend's passionate vouch for the series, and I pressed play. That was the beginning of an emotional roller coaster containing some of the highest highs and some pretty low lows too. A ride I'm still on today. It's why I'm here talking to you now. The book took me to a different place for a while, something all great novels do. It provided me with an escape. I met Lyra and Pan there, and they showed me things I'll never forget. I'm going to talk about a story very dear to my heart for a while, so if you're all in, sit back, take a breath, and I hope you feel something. This is The Golden Compass, His Dark Materials, and Philip Pullman's Legacy of Wonder. And before we get too deep, I just want to say thank you guys for being here. Thank you for checking out this video, and if you enjoy content like this, hit that like button and feel free to subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out a lot over here. So, thanks. The 2007 adaptation of The Golden Compass, the first novel in the series, was a rather sad affair. It boasted a star-studded cast with legends like Nicole Kidman, Daniel Craig, and Ian McKellen, all truly exceptional choices, but with such a large production budget, the film bombed pretty bad. To this day, online reviews don't give the movie much credit either. the film encountered some rather absurd struggles, battling an online mob of religious types boycotting the film before release for its supposedly anti-religious themes. It also received criticism after the fact for omitting many of those very themes due to the studio's reluctance to take a stand in hot water. Fairly late into production, the studio made egregious changes to the film due to their cowardice in wanting to avoid portraying the source material for exactly what it was: a nuanced criticism of organized religion and exploration of spirituality. The studio's move frustrated director Chris Weitz, but back then there was no Snyder Cut, no alternative options, so the film received mediocre reviews and a lukewarm reception. The film ended on what I considered a bit of a cliffhanger at a somewhat odd point in the story considering where the book concludes, but it actually had me excited to see where they might take things. A future we never saw come to fruition because the planned sequel was cancelled due to the poor US box office performance and the Catholic Church's scathing protest. It was all a rather tragic affair by the looks of it. But I'll be honest, despite the film's many shortcomings, there are a few things I think it got right, and some things I love about it to this day. A love I've never been able to find for the HBO His Dark Materials TV series. The film suffers more for what it doesn't do than what it does. While a bit dated, it still looks great, and many scenes still carry their weight today. More than anything, though, it was just too rushed. This was a valid criticism even when it came out, but it's far better illustrated since the HBO series released, by just how much better served the story is, with more time given to the little moments. To the cast. Although, obviously, a TV series has quite the advantage in that department, but I won't give you a dissertation on every high and low point of the film. Only, the cast was phenomenal. There are some strong scenes, and a baffling measure of potential wasted. When the HBO series announced its casting, I was blown away by how strong it was, but there are still players I can't help wishing we could have taken from the film to the TV. Most specifically, Nicole Kidman and Ian McKellen. I'll stand by my opinion that Ruth Wilson's Mrs. Coulter doesn't hold a candle to Kidman's. And despite Joe Tanberg's strong performance as Yorick Burnison, few people on this earth can outmatch Gandalf himself in any role. I loved Daniel Craig as Azriel, but James McAvoy was an undoubtedly worthy successor. And don't even get me started on Daphne King. I was perfectly happy with Dakota Blue Richards as Lyra, but when I heard Daphne Keane was set to take on the heroine, I was beside myself. After Keane absolutely stole the show in Logan, I couldn't think of a better child actress to assume the mantle. Richards did her best with the material given and provided me a lasting impression, but Keane's Lyra was simply given so much more to work with. And while Keane can be unbelievably charming, she can also embody the savage Philip Pullman envisioned her to be. What I'm saying is, I wish the two versions could be melded into one, quite literally with regards to the cast, but in other, more impactful ways I'll talk about a little later. But before I can go on, we need to talk about the source material, the legendary novels themselves. The His Dark Materials trilogy was famously divisive in several ways from the outset. Hell, it was originally published in the middle grade genre. It was a nearly impossible trilogy to put in a box. I mean, back then, and still to this day in some ways, the age of your protagonist defined where you were shelved in bookstores, and Lyra's age alone tossed her into the middle grade pile. Now there's a debate to be had about whether the series could or should move to young adult or even further up the age range, and it eventually found immense success with older audiences, but that just points to one of the biggest struggles that the series has. No one knows what to do with it. Next came the wavering performance of the second and third novels. While the first is still highly praised by critics today, the second and third are more divisive. Some say Pullman took things in the wrong direction, or became too indulgent of his lofty ideas and philosophical commentary and let the story become more nonsensical along the way. I won't say the criticism is invalid, but I will say I didn't care. While The Golden Compass was the introduction to Pullman's world I fell in love with, The subtle knife sent me careening into the Amber Spyglass, eager to devour whatever conclusion awaited. The choices Pullman made with later installments points to his disinterest in fantasy as a broader genre and world building as a whole. While the first book has some phenomenal world building and might be what made the story stand out in the first place to catch the eye of those glancing over the pitch on the back of the book, Pullman felt less and less need to explain himself as the books continued. In 2017, he published a book of essays and speeches largely about writing. I devoured it, and to this day, I'll cite it as both my favorite writing craft book, as well as the most influential one on me. He wrote a whole passage devoted to how he sees writing. More specifically, world building. I'm going to badly summarize this, but he likened the experience of writing to wandering through a forest on a path, and the path is your story. He described how easy it would be to step away, to explore the forest, to get lost admiring the trees. But to him, the most important thing to do was to remain on the path, to serve only the story and avoid unnecessary detours and details along the way. If you want to go the extra mile, it's a chapter called The Path Through the Wood. Check it out, the book is a masterpiece. Throughout the passage, he cites the story of Cinderella, and even his own work, I Was a Rat, in a long-winded explanation I won't read to you here in its entirety. But I think this quote from the passage in Demon Voices sums it up best. That's what I mean by the wood and the path anyway. It's the difference between the story world and the storyline. And I want to stress again that the business of the storyteller is with the storyline, with the path. You can make your story wood, your invented world, as rich and full as you like, but be very, very careful not to be tempted off the path. In my opinion, Pullman fixated on the ideas in his books that interested him most and only built the scaffolding necessary to get him from point A to B. He knew what story he wanted to tell, but after such a bombastic opening novel that remained closer in spirit to other contemporary fantasy works at the time, he enticed a lot of fantasy readers to read the work of a man who has seemingly little interest in the genre at all. See, Pullman is a fantasy author, but refuses to play by fantasy rules, and I think that's what makes things interesting and contributes to the divisive nature of the books. Finally, the largest controversy surrounding the books is the one we've already touched on. The books contain some rather heretical views on religion that ruffled quite a few feathers back in the day, probably more so when the original film came out. I've seen Pullman drawn as some sort of unapologetically brash atheist at times, but that was never my view. Sure, there are some opinions he holds on a number of things I'm not sure I agree with, but I never felt the books were inappropriately disrespectful to anyone in particular. I always felt they contained the nuance that allowed the material to present itself as art. Thought-provoking and meaningful rather than ideological propaganda. Later, Pullman would go on to clarify his views on all this in both interviews as well as essays and speeches contained in the aforementioned novel Demon Voices, where he had the chance to dig a little deeper. He continually states the subtext his novels contained were not barbs aimed at faith, God, or even the idea of religion itself, but the more scathing critiques were supremely directed at the failings of organized religions, most specifically the point at which they can become corrupt and oppressive. But that's all I'll say on the subject. I frankly don't find it that interesting because there's just so much more here to be discussed.
Oh, I don't care.
So let's go back to the first time I read The Golden Compass. I stood at my new job, a cog in someone else's machine, surrounded by more industrial machines. A job that didn't make me feel like I was worth anything. I lifted the earbuds to my ears and pressed play. All the noise faded for a while as Pullman himself, because what's cooler than being good enough to narrate your own novels, told me a story that stuck with me to this day. He introduced me to Lyra, the girl that infiltrated my heart. No, but seriously, the audible production of this trilogy is phenomenal. Anyway, you see, growing up, I was always drawn to fantasy novels, most notably Chronicles of Narnia and Lord of the Rings, but also Canterbury Tales, Aragon, Ender's Game, and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. A broad range, I know, but when I dig a little deeper into the stories I really latched onto, I found a special wonder all my favorites contained. When I got older and returned to reading, I discovered His Dark Materials and Neil Gaiman's collection of whimsical stories. Most notably for me, Neverwhere, The Ocean at the End of the Lane, Norse Mythology, and The Graveyard Book. Obviously, Gaiman has far more books than that, but I'm only referencing the ones that introduced me to his work and contain the very element I'm preparing to tell you about. So now that I'm older, I find myself searching for the same wonder I found when I was a kid, hoping I haven't read all the books that will excite me the way those did. I often wish I could just go back and experience many of those stories for the first time. Just one more time. So I search for new stories that might affect me the same way, but often, even when I'm gifted a pleasurable reading experience, it just isn't the same. I've spent years trying to define just what infects me about those stories I loved so much. You could easily pick them apart and come to all sorts of conclusions about story quality or genre, but I've been there before. The answers I found didn't suffice. It's why so many friends can tell me, hey man, if you like X, then this other X is right up your alley. Only for me to eagerly dive into the recommended work and find it was nowhere near the new wonder I hoped to discover. Through all my contemplation, I returned to one word: whimsy. It's why, as an adult, I attached myself to Philip Pullman and Neil Gaiman. Both presented me with stories containing the same whimsy I immersed myself in as a child. The worlds where things don't quite make sense, but they don't have to. And that's the beauty of it. So hold on to this idea, because it's important to the point I'm trying to make. I found His Dark Materials as something vaguely resembling an adult, but I latched onto it because it made me feel like a kid in ways. Not because the story was immature or unserious at all, but because it contained that same wonder, that whimsy I'd been searching for. I don't think I'm alone here either. I think it's why, despite the middle grade genre pigeonhole, the books couldn't remain shackled to one target demographic, and Pullman's story affected readers of all ages. The tale is magical, but it's also dark too. It doesn't shy away from heavy subjects, but all the best children's stories don't. In fact, as a kid, I always gravitated towards the stories that presented themselves with accessible language, but didn't talk down to me. They treated me like an individual. They respected little 11-year-old me. I'll never forget the Amber Spyglass, when Lyra and Will board the boat that will ferry them to the land of the dead, and Lyra is forced to leave Pan shivering and alone on the dock, her demon abandoned. The day I read that passage, it rained on my eyes a little. His Dark Materials is the series I wanted as a kid. It's true. Some themes, metaphors, and implications might have gone right over my head if I had read it young, but in my view, Pullman never betrays the value of the grounded story for grandstanding. He doesn't break up the adventure to preach for a page or two about the novel's subtext. It's all there, but you can enjoy and understand it at your own pace, all the while still experiencing a grand adventure. All the best children's books do that. So let's wrap back around to the adaptations and tie this all together. I'll be blunt. I've got some major problems with the HBO series. The first 3 episodes were weak enough to turn me off to the show entirely for a bit. Don't get me wrong, there are truly remarkable bits and some great performances, but the show is nothing if not inconsistent. It's frequently clunky and teeters between looking like a big budget masterpiece and goofy made-for-TV drivel. But then again, it is a TV show. Maybe HBO just set the bar too high for even them to maintain. Either way, I'm not going to bash the show, because I love Daphne Keene's Lyra, and frankly, the show does so many things better than the 2007 film that it's nearly impossible to compare the two. They're made for 2 very different mediums and play by different rules entirely, both dictated by the eras in which they were made and the limitations of the mediums. When I returned to the show and completed the first season, I honestly enjoyed it. After the first 3 episodes are behind you, it becomes a far more enjoyable ride, and as a show standing on its own without the legacy of its source material looming behind, it's pretty good. But just that, pretty good, nothing more. Not yet, at least. I'll give it time to work through the source material, and who knows, maybe it will become great. But as of right now, it's got some work to do. My greatest qualms are with the ways the show handles the book's plot. I don't want to be the person that cries because the show isn't exactly like the book though. By all means, I understand why the show made many of the adaptation choices they did, only I don't think they landed right. They undercut several things that made the book special for me. Now, I don't want to get bogged down in review, but I also know I can't just say something like that without giving you guys a little more substance. So I'll say this. 1. I hate everything about the way Will Perry's storyline was handled in season 1 from start to finish. 2. The presentation of religious themes reflects exactly how much time has changed since 2007 by the way the show indulges the heavy-handed approach. It's clunky and awkward at times for it. 3. Ruth Wilson's Mrs. Coulter makes me want to claw my eyes out, and not in the good way. And 4, the season 1 finale totally botched Roger's death, and the entire sequence revealing Azrael's portal is underwhelming, capping off a season with significant potential with more a whimper than the war cry it meant. Okay, now that that's out of the way, I can't just leave it on such a low note. So here's something I really appreciated. The show makes great use of the TV medium to spend far more time with characters and build relationships in ways even the books themselves don't. As stated before, I still don't love the way Mrs. Coulter is handled, but overall, the attention to character building is a high point for the series. So just to be clear, because I know I'll probably catch flack for this, I enjoyed the show after the opening episodes, and find it to be a valuable and quality TV show when explicitly not compared to the source material. I'm certain the show reached a whole new audience that the books hadn't. And for brand new viewers, most of my criticisms float away because they rely too much on book comparison, and I acknowledge that. I try my best not to be the type of guy that rages because an adaptation isn't like the book, and I don't want that to be how this comes across, especially because the quality of the TV show isn't the point of this piece at all. So let me tie this all together. His Dark Materials on HBO overshadows the 2007 Golden Compass film in every way but one. It succeeds largely due to being allowed the time and care to develop a story more true to the novel's intent. I don't hold the film's lack of quality against its director, Chris Weitz, though. The film was a product of its time and faltered because of it. I rather preferred many of the visuals, set design, and even the score of the 2007 film to the HBO series. Though on the subject of score, it's a close race, because the TV series does shine in that category too. But let's stray away from such grounded takes to something loftier, since you guys know that's what I'm all about. I took great care to explain how the books made me feel, the wonder and whimsy they contained. So do you see where I'm going with this? I don't think the HBO series is made for children. In fact, few things on HBO are. The show carries an undeniably dark tone and moves slower than a snail at times. Despite the homage it tries to pay to the source material, it never quite captures the spirit. At least, not for me. Now, you can argue in the comments section all you want about whether or not the original novels were made for children at all, but to me, they were. For all its flaws, the 2007 film has some high points too. The magic, the world building, the visual depictions, the character portrayals. Most notably, Mrs. Coulter and Yorick Burnison. It strikes one nail on the head, the one I've wanted to talk about this whole time. It's the type of film I'd want to show my kids. It's a film that can grip their attention, not bore them. It walks the line between demographics far better, in my opinion, than the HBO show. Now that's not to say it does so perfectly either, only it doesn't leave the wonder behind in the way I feel the TV show does. I'm not stupid enough to go around claiming the 2007 film is better than the HBO series. I rewatched both the film and the first season of the show entirely to prepare for this piece. Watching them back to back shed far more light than I expected on the gaps between the interpretations. The 2007 film simply cannot stand up against the latest adaptation, but I don't think that negates the value it had. When I watched the film as a teen before I was really familiar with the books, I enjoyed it. It scratched my fantasy itch and left me wanting more, mostly because it introduced me to a world I didn't want to leave. I wanted a demon of my own. I mean, don't we all? But I can't say the same for the HBO series. The series presents a murky world. It feels cold and wet. And maybe that's okay. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, and that's exactly how Pullman envisioned it. I'm not really talking about Lyra's physical world anyway. I guess to put a bow on it all, I'll say this. The HBO series doesn't take me away from anything at all. The wonder just isn't there. The whimsy. Something the books did no matter how cold and dark they got. Maybe it's just too close to reality, to the truth. The HBO series presents a terrifying world in which 13-year-old me wouldn't want to join Lyra on her quest to find out what dust really is. It doesn't make me want to comfort Lyra on the boat to the land of the dead as Pan fades into the fog. It doesn't fill me with wonder or inspire bravery, it makes me want to stay home. Take that for whatever it's worth. What do I know anyway? But the tragically castrated 2007 Golden Compass film did all that for me. With all the flaws in the world, it still presented me with strong emotions. And maybe that's the most important thing in art. It took me for a whimsical ride and filled me with wonder. I would have hopped in Lee Scoresby's balloon and followed Lyra to the Northern Lights, just like Roger. Have a good night.